In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a pair of capris. For this project, you're going to need scissors, an invisible zipper, pins, fabric, I went with a non-stretch cotton, paper, rulers, pen, thread, and then a pair of pants or capris that we already have to be able to trace the pattern from. So we're going to place these pants onto our paper and use them as a stencil, tracing the existing seams. It's important in this step to maneuver the seams so they're lying as flat as possible. If you need to do any repositioning, just make sure that you put some markers so you're able to put the pants in the same position. If it's not perfect, we can do some alterations in the next steps. And then we're going to do the exact same for the back of the pants. The back pattern is always going to have a bigger curve, as you can see here. We're also going to place a dart in the back, which can be a little bit tricky, but again, we can make adjustments later if it's not perfect. So as you can see, in the middle of the back piece pattern, I'm pivoting it by 2 centimeters, and that is going to be my dart. And then I'm just going to continue tracing the outline of the existing pants. I'm just going to smoothly connect all the lines that I just traced, and for that I'm going to use a ruler. I have a few different shapes of sewing rulers, which makes it a lot easier to trace out the lines. And I'm going to do that for the front and the back, and then cut out my 2 pattern pieces. When making pants, I like to do a mock first because they can be a little trickier. So for the mock, I'm going to use a fabric that's really similar in weight to the actual fabric I'll be using. And I'm just going to cut out 2 of the front and 2 of the back pieces and mark out where my dart is going to be placed, which I do by just cutting out 2 little slits at the top of the fabric. So you're going to have 4 pieces, which are going to be mirror images of themselves. And then you're going to sew the 2 back crotches right sides together and the 2 front crotches right sides together. And just sew that with a straight stitch. Now we're going to sew the 2 pieces together, sewing the 2 outside seams and then the whole inside seam. It's important that you leave open the top of one of the sides of your capris about 15 to 25 centimeters. This is where we're going to be putting the zipper, but I usually don't do that for the mock-up and I just leave it open. And then we're going to sew along where we pinned. Okay, now we're going to try on the pattern that we just created, pinning the zipper side closed, and this is where we're going to make all of our adjustments. You want to have the pants inside out for this step so we can just pin at the seams where we want to take it in. If your pants are too small, it's a little trickier, but you can still make the adjustments. All you're going to do is open up the seam and with your measuring tape, measure how open the seam is, and we're going to mark that down onto our pattern in the next step. Here I wanted to show you 3 common mistakes that you might be dealing with and what kind of alterations you'd want to make to your pattern to correct this. Then we're going to use our measuring tape to make sure the adjustments that we made are the same on both sides, and you can move around the pins a little bit if you need to, and then we're going to sew where we pinned. And then trim away the excess fabric, making sure we're leaving a 1 centimeter seam allowance around all the seams. And here I'm just making sure that my darts are the same width and length and equally placed on both sides. You can even mark it out in pencil or pen if you like. Now we're going to use a seam ripper to undo all of the stitches that we just sewed to make it easier to make adjustments on our original pattern. So we're going to take our pattern pieces and pin it onto the paper pattern and trace out any of the adjustments. If you need to make your pattern bigger, you can tape on some extra paper onto your original pattern or just retrace out your pattern. And then you're going to cut the adjustments that you just made. It's important that you're leaving 1 centimeter seam allowance on top and 3 centimeters on the bottom to hem. Now we're going to create our facing. So starting with the front piece, we're going to trace the outside to the side seam, marking out the center front, folding it on the center front, and then mirroring out that tracing. I made the width of my facing 6 centimeters, and then I added a 1 centimeter seam allowance around the entire pattern piece. And then I cut it out. And then we're going to do the exact same for the back piece, but just keeping in mind the darts. So all we need to do for the dart is to close the dart and continuing on, which will create more of an angle when tracing out that back facing. And then again, folding it in half on the center back and then tracing out the other side, not forgetting to close the dart. And then I'm adding 6 centimeters of width and adding 1 centimeter on every edge for my seam allowance. And now I have 4 pieces to my pattern for my capris, which are all the pieces that we're going to use to create the actual pair. And we can now cut that out of the real fabric that we want to use. Making sure you're cutting mirror images for the front and back pieces. So you're cutting out one front piece and then flipping your pattern and cutting out the second front piece so you're getting the opposite. And we're going to do that for the front and the back. Then we're going to sew these pieces the exact same way that we sewed the mock, starting with sewing the two crotches together, right sides together. Then we're going to sew the front and the back pieces together, pinning at the seams and making sure again to leave 20 centimeters open on one of the side seams. And then we can sew along where we pinned. Then we can pin and sew our darts as well, and we can use a measuring tape to make sure that they're equal and perfectly placed. The next step is the invisible zipper, and there's a few steps I like to put into place to make sure that it all goes well. And I'm going to start by sewing up the side seam with the largest stitch that we have on our machine, and then ironing that open. Then on the inside of the fabric, I'm going to put the right side down of the zipper, and using a hand sewing needle, I'm going to stitch that with a basting stitch into place. Then using my zipper foot, I'm going to sew that zipper into place. The head of the zipper is going to get in the way, but we can sew as close as we can and then sew the rest in a later step. Then we're going to use our seam ripper to undo our basting stitch that we did with our hand sewing needle and to open up the seam that we sewed with the large stitch of our sewing machine. And then we can move the zipper head out of the way to be able to then sew the top part of our zipper down. With the zipper now open, you may be able to sew a little closer to the zipper as well. The next step is completely optional, but I'm going to show you how to finish your edges with a bias strip, and it can equally be done with a zigzag stitch or a serger if you have one. Okay, we're going to start by cutting our bias strip, and then we're going to cut away the excess fabric along the side seam, and then we're going to place our bias strip right sides together along the edge of the seam, and we're going to sew that down with a straight stitch. Then we're going to iron that piece open, flip it over, fold it over 1 centimeter, iron that down, and then fold it over another centimeter and iron it down again. Then we're going to place a pin, catching both sides of that fabric, and we're going to sew along where we pinned with a straight stitch. I'm going to do this step for all of my raw edges, but again, this is totally optional and you do not need to. You can also just go over your edges with a zigzag stitch. Now we're going to move on to the waistband, and we're going to sew the side closed according to the diagram so that we're leaving the other side open to accommodate the zipper. And now, making sure to fold in the 1 centimeter seam allowance on the side of the zipper, we're going to attach the facing to the pants right sides together. So the right side of the front of the pants to the right side of the front of the facing, and the same for the back. Again, folding in that 1 centimeter seam allowance along the zipper, and then we're just going to sew with a straight stitch. Then we want to iron what we just sewed with the seam allowance facing up towards the facing. We're going to do a top stitch to lock in that seam allowance just beside the seam on the facing. This will help create a way crisper edge for the top of our pants. And then we want to finish it off with another iron. I then like to place pins at the zipper and the 2 side seams to lock that facing in place. Before I stitch down where I pinned, I'm going to finish off the bottom of the facing with a zigzag stitch just to make sure that none of the threads fray. And then I'm going to go over where I pinned with a few stitches. The last step is to hem the capris, so I'm just going to fold it over twice, iron it down, place pins, and then sew with a straight stitch. And I'm going to do that for both sides. And you're all done! Thank you so much for watching, and if you liked this video, please subscribe.